Hello and welcome to the live Cybersecurity Awareness Forum. I'm Scott Wright from ClickArmor, and ClickArmor is happy to be sponsoring this series of webinars, which are really fun live panel discussions around different security topics, but all kind of from a security awareness perspective. So really happy with last month's turnout. We had 65 people signed up. I think we had 20 people at least on, and this time we've got over 75 people, I think, signed up. So that's awesome. Really appreciate people spreading the word. So I think a lot of you have been on before, and if you're not familiar with the process, basically, I've just got a few slides we use to guide us through a couple of concepts, and then we sort of turn over we ask some questions and turn it over to each panelist to give input on, but we also want input from you, the attendees, with any comments on whatever the panelists are saying, good or bad, and questions, and maybe even tips. If you've got lessons learned, everybody would benefit from that. So that's the way we're going to operate it. And so the first thing I like to do usually is get a little roundtable from people to see where they're coming in from. So just if you can type your first name maybe and where you're coming from, that would be awesome. So I know we got Joseph from Tampa, we got Dan from Kansas, Matt from faraway Richmond. We're not sure which state or province that is, but let's say it's some romantic place. Juan from Puerto Rico. Thanks for joining us, Juan. Terry and Tyler, of course, from Bakersfield, California, regular member of our panel. AJ Leese from Calgary. I think we said Dan from Kansas. Dennis from West Virginia. Thanks for joining us, Dennis. So we'll probably have a few more stragglers come in. Like I said, last time we had over 20, I think. So they'll arrive as they get out of their other meetings. But nothing to stop us from getting started. Just a reminder, we will post these sessions. All of them are posted live, or not live, but recordings are posted on the ClickArmor website, clickarmor.ca/CSAF. and on our ClickArmor YouTube channel. So let's just dive into things. This month, or this session, we're actually going to be talking about something that, security awareness people don't really get a chance to talk about much, and that is business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response. So, we often talk a lot about, what do we teach people about avoiding phishing and social engineering, but there are some really important topics that I think people would appreciate hearing about. So throughout this session, we'll just use the chat feature for you to type your feedback if we ask a question. So when you see questions on the slides, love to hear your input on them, like I said, and we'll also get the panelists' input as well. So I decided to put together, I like to sort of set the context with a slide. So not very professionally done, but I think people appreciate that it's tailored for this session. So let's look at it that way. So what level of detail makes sense for general employee awareness for business continuity planning and disaster recovery? And I found this really interesting diagram. I just did a Google search on these things, and I looked on images. And one of them that sort of stood out at me was just a sequence of steps or activities that sort of tend to happen when you have an event, whether it's a disaster or some other kind of outage, and the things that typically would have to be addressed. And these are things that mostly the IT team or the business continuity teams would have to focus on. But I think it's good to look at it from an employee point of view, general employee point of view. What are the things that really they need to understand and be taught about and maybe practice? So looking at it from beginning to end, I identified things like safety. It's important for everybody to get themselves safe. The other things like physical, electrical, environmental, IT recovery, those are kind of specialized things that, everybody, can't do work if you don't have power. But from the point of view of the process here, we really want to focus things like procedures for productivity purposes. What do you actually expect people to do to get themselves back online and productive? And then at the end, getting things back to normal is something we all have to communicate about. Are we there yet? When will we be there, et cetera? So this is just a way I put together of this. I found it on a website, ivancorderotorres.com. And so I'll give him credit for that, but I added a few little flourishes. So disaster recovery, as probably some of you don't know, but maybe not everybody does. we distinguish disaster recovery and business continuity in a couple of ways. And anybody is free to chime in here with things that I've either gotten wrong or you'd like to elaborate on. But I've always, talked to business continuity and disaster recovery folks. They're special people, right? And they understand all these things. But generally, when you're talking about disaster, you're talking about what we call a smoking hole. So meaning that the stuff that you rely on to get stuff work done on a daily basis is just gone, right? One way or another, whether it was a flood or a fire or something. And so, the teams are responsible for making sure that there is some kind of backup in place. Maybe it's at another site where you can turn things on, but that's going to take a while to get back online. And so all of these things have to be taken into account, and everybody kind of has to understand what the process is and what they need to know about it. So just want to get your thoughts, first of all, on the whole process. Let's start with AJ.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, the whole business continuity, the first thing before you even get down to process is you have to go through the scenario planning. What could happen? How long can our assets, this business unit, this person in some cases be without the work that they're doing? And what does that look like for the business? How do we recover? Is that, major, minor, severe, critical, et cetera? So when you go through that scenario planning, you think through those things first, then you can start to come up with these solutions. And then when you're putting together these solutions with regards to your awareness training or any of your security program, you want to make sure that the people who are responsible know their part in the disaster recovery effort and where it's supposed to go. So if you don't have a really core role to play and you're just sort of hey, collect your things and get out of the way, that needs to be the expectation that gets set and made abundantly clear that, disaster management will reach out to you if need be, kind of thing. So as long as when you're putting this stuff together, making sure that everybody is acutely aware of what they're supposed to do in these situations, that would be the main focus of the training as it goes along.
Cool. Any distinction you would like to make in terms of the process between disaster recovery and business continuity?
Well, yeah, disaster recovery, I think, in my view anyway, is mostly this is something we couldn't control, or some form of an unknown or a known but less likely to happen, whereas business continuity is more along the lines of how do we keep this thing rolling with the stuff that we can predict. So you equate disasters to natural disasters. That's a really common one, and the ones that nobody sees coming, like our data center exploded. Right. So, you want to make sure that you have some
struck by a meteor or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was a data center in Calgary that exploded. Like it blew up and it caused this reverberating effect for a lot of IT businesses because they had maybe thought of some of that. They had warm and cold sites, but what if the initial source just simply ceased to exist and the fire department has it all locked up? There were a lot of revisits to DR plans when that happened, for sure.
Awesome. Tyler, any thoughts on the general process and what we're talking about?
Well, I think it's really interesting that we look at this from the security awareness point of view, especially when it gets down to the specific employee, because I find, and I think you guys might agree that, a lot of organizations have these plans, right? Business continuity and, disaster recovery. But I find that on an individual level, employees are often just totally unaware. You ask them, what happens if you get hit with ransomware, or if, your server explodes, or, what have you. They're not really clued in. And, to AJ's point, I think it's important they know their role, because there are, more people than not that are just going to have to okay, go with the flow, collect your things. This is, what you got to do. But I think it's important to lay that out in terms of, what are the planned things we know can happen.
Yeah.
Right. With the business continuity. And then with disaster recovery, that's a big rabbit hole you can go down, because AJ just mentioned it. You can have the craziest things happen. You could have two, lines going to your server center, a coax and a fiber, and they could have separate entry points, and they could both get, cut at the same time. You never know. But I think having those plans and giving the roles out to people, and I think as far as the awareness point of view, I think having the individual confidence, just that if something goes wrong, as an individual employee, I know that there's a plan, and other people are going to direct me, and maybe, it's not super specific, but
Yeah.
I think that's just important for that sense of, well-being, because, more often than not, situation happens like that. And everybody's freaking out.
Yeah, I think it's about, setting expectations. And I think Dennis made a good sort of distinction here, that disaster recovery is focused on the systems. Like, how do you get those systems back and working so that people can get to work? But business continuity is more about the organizational processes. So, we could talk about business impact assessments, which is part of that business continuity planning process. Most employees don't really see that part of the process. But what I think is, something we're going to focus on in some of the questions I'm going to dig into later is, what do people need to know about this? And from the point of view of business continuity, they should know that we have some defined processes. The business has analyzed which processes are essential to the organization for it to operate and meet its mandate. And I think that's really key to what we're going to be talking about. Anybody else in the chat have any general comments or questions? All right. So let's look at it from the point of view of stakeholders. So what stake do employees have in the BCP and DR processes? So, we pointed out on the earlier slide, there's personal safety. Obviously, they want to make sure they're safe. And that could be a consideration, I think, both in a disaster and a business continuity perspective as well. And then business productivity. Everybody wants to know when they get back to work, really, right? Any other thoughts on what generally, when we think of the stakeholders, what we should be considering with respect to all employees?
Well, I'm not sure that anybody's ever in a hurry to get back to work. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, especially when it's something super easy, like, the office flooded, I guess I can't go in. But in reality, I think when you talk to it from an employee perspective, you want to hand them the information that they need, but not so much that you're necessarily overburdening them. An emergency situation is chaotic, no matter what's happening, no matter where you sit in it. So the stakeholder information needs to be relevant to the role that they provide in those programs, but not so much that they're basically overburdened and they lose track of what they have to be spending their time on. Similarly, one of the main stakeholders you should have, depending on the size of your business and how critical or sensitive it might be, is some form of incident management. Somebody whose entire job is to kind of coordinate everything. And that's a pretty hectic role in and of itself. But it really does make it go a lot easier when it comes to any major incidents, or if you're an organization that has like a wide footprint, having that centralized incident management, even if it just gets handed over to somebody else, you have a chain of 3 or 4 that you pass back and forth to, making sure that stakeholder is very well informed of what everybody's doing so that they can make strategic decisions. That's an important component.
Cool. Tyler?
Oh, I just wanted to first point out in the comments, Joseph Young talking about he has to deal with hurricanes and displaced workers, or preparing for a data center that might be underwater. And I just wanted to drill into that example because I think there is, we all know there's a hierarchy of needs, right? AJ, your example of office is flooded, I get the day off, or, whatever, that's great. But then, when you get to hurricanes where there's a serious human cost, first and foremost, people have to, feel like they're safe. And, obviously that's an extreme example, but it is something that people deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the individual employees, just knowing, okay, maybe a little event, like you have a day off, but, at least in my experience dealing with like ransomware, when I see, business leaders that don't have any plan for it, that feeling goes straight down, the chain of custody to the individual employee, where they don't even know if they're going to have a job.
Right.
And I've seen different responses to it. I've seen really amazing companies where they got hit, they didn't have a plan, and employees clocked in, 20, 30 extra hours a week just to get through it. And, they made a plan on the fly, but I've also seen it where it's like, oh, well, they don't have a plan, we're not going to get out of this. Why am I going to, clock in more hours? We're going to be underwater. And of course, to recover from these, you need the input, and people got to be able to effectuate, change in the new plans. So I think ensuring, that they have, a place that the company is going to make it, and making sure that that's a widely held belief is like at the top of that hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I mean,
they
why
need some
go to work
reassurance,
if you're not going to have a job?
Yeah, they need that assurance that things are going to, first of all, that there is a plan, it's going to be okay, hopefully. Dennis pointed out, when defining MTDs, you really have to talk to the stakeholders, and they tend to define the MTD differently than the IT team does. Now, first of all, what is an MTD? Thanks, Dennis. Maximum tolerable downtime. All right. So for a system or process. So yeah, thoughts on that, guys?
Well, everybody's going to say it's the least amount, right? We can only afford to take 10 minutes, maybe 1 minute every several years, when in reality it's email, and it's by and large can stay down for the rest of the day or the rest of the year, and it won't matter. So it's one of these situations where when you're having these conversations, you also need to level set what those expectations are, right? Yeah, the mailroom can probably stay closed for a little while, and here's why. No, the call center can't stay closed because, so we have to have a separate one over here. So when you come to that, and that goes hand in hand with that scenario planning too, by understanding, okay, under what circumstances could we possibly have this down for a while? Like what sort of situations could happen where we just couldn't recover in time, something well outside of our actual control. And then, have those meaningful conversations with, this is what we can afford to put into this, or this is the cost of doing this versus the cost of doing nothing. So there's going to be a lot of like cost benefit conversations being had around this, because if you can't sell the business on, we need to have a separate call center because we're going to lose X amount of revenue over Y amount of time. They're not going to stand you up a hot call center. They're going to say, get everybody a cell phone and away we go. So it's one of these things where you just have to really, the presentation of it has to come with, a lot of dollars and cents.
That's great. Tyler, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think your point about dollars and cents is where it all goes back to, right? Follow the money, look at the cash flow. I think getting employees and stakeholders input prior, when you're going to make these plans, and that's a real important distinction between, what is the MTD like for your convenience and productivity. I'm sure a lot of people would say, oh, I can't go without my 3 monitors or something like that, whereas it's like, okay, what is the bare bones that you can get by? Okay, you need QuickBooks, you need access to the accounting, we got to do these invoices. Like what is the actual minimum, and what is your, I guess, baseline for productivity? Because I find that there's often a big disparity between where you're optimally productive as an employee and where you're able to get by. And, obviously we want to be up here, but when stuff gets bad, you got to know that you can make it through.
Yeah.
Because I've heard firsthand from businesses where, their systems go down. One of them was, like a SQL database that backed up their entire operation. And it was, we can't afford to go down for a week. And that it ended up, they were down for a month and a half. Because they were able to rally. They didn't have a plan, but they figured out, okay, we can do these by hand and by spreadsheets. But it took them a while to rally. Whereas if they had that plan, there would have been, that free. I mean, I get the freak out, right? It's ransomware. Nobody wants that. But they could have, had a much easier go of it if they had known, okay, we're going to get behind. We're going to have to do this by hand, and we might have to hire some more people, but this is recoverable, assuming, that people input that time and effort, but without getting that information from the individual employee, in each area, I don't think you're going to be able to really formulate an accurate and, usable plan. I think from the top down, it can be almost dangerous to prescribe a plan as to what you think will work, versus, talking to the people that are actually, going to have to, act out that plan when, stuff hits the fan.
Yeah. And this is an awesome discussion because I wasn't really sure how to start this whole conversation, but I thought if we just started asking about the stakeholders, that it might generate some good discussion. I think this was really important because the planning part does come first, but it doesn't involve necessarily all the employees. You can't poll every employee to find out what their perspective on DR is. Right? But what I think is more practical is you can ask business leaders that represent different parts of the organization and know their constituents or their employees well enough to say, here's what's going to impact our employees, here's what they care about, here's what I think they need to know, right? So I think it's been a really good discussion. Thanks very much, guys. And I know Dennis put in a note here about,
I was just gonna talk to that, because I think even before you go through interviewing every stakeholder, the one question that needs to get answered in the business is, how do we make money? Like that's core. Yeah. That's core and central. And it's often one of those things that just gets summarily ignored because they assume that gravy train is going to keep chugging along. But when you think about it from this perspective, if you talk to all these stakeholders and it's, okay, we've come up with an order of operations to bring all these systems up, and you forget the factory floor where the widgets are being made. I mean, all the invoice resiliency in the world isn't going to matter if you can't ship anything. Similarly to what was just said here, the DR plan's failing to understand these dependencies. Yeah, I mean, cool. We have a secondary call center, but they can't talk to anybody. They're isolated because the network has been taken down and the engineers are at the bottom of the list. So understanding how your business runs at its core and really keeping that going as much as you can, or being in a position where we can afford to shut this whole thing down for a month while we rebuild this properly. Whatever that looks like for the business is a conversation that has to happen long before we even put pen to paper. So understanding how all of these departments interconnect, all these business units work together, and where the money flow actually comes from, that needs to be done before we're even down this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important for, people on the call who are managing, IT security awareness programs, for example, they should understand, those dynamics within the organization and where that information comes from around business continuity and how it's going to be used in the future. So we're going to talk about that next is what communication media and processes are appropriate when you're actually trying to educate people, or you don't even have to, it's even before education, because we're going to talk about training separately in a minute, but just what do people need to be communicated in general about this stuff?
I think that, like we talked about, in the planning phase, finding that balance between, in a perfect world, you talk to every employee, sit them down for a couple hours, they give you exactly what they need, they're able to level with you. And obviously, maybe for some organizations that are really small, that's possible. But getting down to at least, at the very least, like a departmental level or
right.
Functional areas, like AJ was saying, right, with the factory floor. I mean, it doesn't matter, if one of those areas is necessary for cash flow and you can get the other areas up, it doesn't matter. So I think beforehand, you need to get that input. But then, once something happens, I think you need to, AJ touched on this earlier, have people that are dedicated to orienting, the ship. That way someone they can look that shouldn't be a burden that each employee, feels like they're bearing.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have leadership and someone to look to. But I also think, articulating, very, codified, steps for what that employee, or department is to do, and how it's going to, work and interact. And I think with some insight into how the other areas of the business are managing is important. Obviously, focusing on their individual area is of utmost importance, but I think that, knowing how the machine goes together in a, worst case scenario, at least, from my perspective, it helps make sense of things. When you're having to do a new process, it may be like, okay, why am I doing it this way? And I think just a little bit of insight, from the top down will, make that a lot easier and clearer and, allow them to act it out in a better way.
Cool. And that can come before training, right? It's just giving maybe a regular update to people about, hey, did you know our maximum tolerable downtime is whatever, right? And that's something for people to know. That's what we expect. We'll be back up in a certain amount of time, right? AJ?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I like this question here, the communication media. This is really important because when you have a disaster situation, everybody's going to refer to whatever available information they have, right? That's what they're looking for. And you think about when a plane's crashing, they don't sit there and just push buttons in the ether. They take out the big fat turtle cracker checklist and start reading through each of the steps, right? So that they can, fix this problem. So, when it comes to anything like personal safety, like you mentioned here, that communication media needs to be so abundantly clear that there is no room for misinterpretation. You mentioned your color blindness, making sure that the fonts and the colors don't lead to that ambiguity. If you can't see green on red, like if you're missing something, that's really important, right? Like that's some pretty important information. So keeping those things considerable and accessible, like anything that has to do with, life and personal safety is greater than else. It's just stuff. The business will rebuild, burn it all down. Right? Make sure your people are okay. And then when it comes to like the business productivity, again, this is where we have the conversations about who gets brought up first in the DR plan. What can we work without? What do we need to have up right away? What can last a day, a week, a month, et cetera? So those can be a little bit more nuanced. Those can be a little bit more intensive because you have some time to bring some of that up. But other than that, we live in an age where computers are considerably more powerful than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. There's no reason why so much of this couldn't just be an automated process, depending on what it is. It requires a lot of engineering and a lot of overhead and a lot of testing and validation. But if there's something that is really critical and important, and more importantly, easily mistaken or easily messed up, you want to make sure that you have as many controls around that as possible if that's a really important process. So being able to understand those things and then communicate that effectively in a way that's accessible to all your employees, that's one of the best ways you can get through a disaster scenario.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things I was thinking of as I made up this question was, suppose a disaster or major incident, business continuity incident or outage does happen. How should an employee expect to be informed about what's going on and what they should do, right? Because it could be something that they weren't trained on. We might need them to do something different. So what channels do you typically see where management is communicating with all employees during a time when the network may be out?
Well, they're sending everyone emails, and with little regard to whether or not email's even up and running.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think
That's what
that's an
everybody's used to.
interesting point. You bring that up because I saw that firsthand, or it was an on-prem, Outlook server. And that was the means they communicated with their employees. And they also had a cloud-based phone system. So when the attack happened, gone, both of them. So no one could use their business emails. We ended up, porting them to Office 365, but in the interim, they didn't have that planned out. And that's where, the backup of, cell phones or text messages is good. I think email is always the easiest medium, but if you have something that's vulnerable and that can go out, I think you need to have a easy way to get to everybody, because I think everybody has it ingrained. Okay, check my email. That's the official, means. I've seen Slack channels for companies that that seems to be a pretty reliable way. Once people get, informed and used to using that as a means of communication.
Yeah.
But I think the awareness of backup communication methods is also key there, especially when email is often the primary, means of reaching people.
Yeah. Fletus Poston just joined us from North Carolina. Welcome, Fletus.
I can make it. I apologize for being delayed.
No worries. We've been obviously talking about disaster recovery, business continuity. I know, Fletus, you've been involved in a lot of security operations, probably quite a few situations that involve outages and maybe disasters, not sure. But we're talking at the moment about the communication channels and generally what do people need to be informed of, not so much how to report an incident. Everybody, typically, if there's a disaster or a major outage, a lot of people know about it at the same time, right? But where do they go for information? Where do they go to find out how to get themselves, either safe or back up and productive?
Yeah, I mean, as I shared some of our offline discussions, I think the biggest thing for organizations to do is to do not if, but when with their employees. So just continue to do the not if, that when. From my point of view, like thinking about incident response, I had I attended a talk many years ago, about a year ago, maybe now, about a whitewater rafting. They know they're going to fall out. So it's not if they fall out of the raft, it's when they fall out of the raft. I think we do that with our employees. When the event happens, this is what we're going to do. This is how we will communicate with you. It will be a text. It'll be a phone call. It'll be an email. It'll be a desktop notification. If you have questions, we'll have a portal. Go to this portal. We'll share that updates with you. There'll be an incident response team or business response team that'll be stood up. They will be meeting. They will be internal and external, depending on the type of event. So just helping them know what the channels are. So I saw that you had on the slide previously that is it could be email. It could be a phone. Phone trees work. I mean, people forget about that legacy technology, but when you start the phone and it dials every single employee and then you respond, are you safe or you not? Then you got your head count. Same with the desktop notifications or the text notifications. There's a 1-2 option in there. So practicing those and even drilling those, a previous company I worked with just did a drill prior to me changing and going to a different organization. And it was it's annoying to have your phone blow up, your desktop yell at you, but it gets your attention and you understand that this is what it's going to look like when it happens, not if it happens. So,
yeah, that's cool. I mean, I sort of first started thinking about this not long ago when a client of mine had actually a scare, or it was sort of a phishing message or something. And it wasn't really a full outage, but the IT team decided that they were going to disable or suspend everybody's remote access for a period of time. And all of a sudden, people couldn't get into their accounts. So they had no idea what to do. And so it sort of just highlights the idea of, gee, what could we have done to, get people maybe to go to a particular website to get information about how to reset, their access and stuff like that. So just another sort of channel that I think we don't often think about, that we have to use to keep the general population of employees aware of that stuff.
Yeah, you got to test it regularly. Like Fletus said, you have to test these. And in reality, you should probably test your phone trees at least every quarter, because phone numbers can change, people come and go, especially in a higher turnover environment like security operations. From a pure incident response standpoint, those out-of-band communications are critical, because if I'm the attacker and I've compromised your email system and I'm watching you watch me, all I have to do is just bypass everything. So, to Dennis's point about having a well-documented incident response plan where everybody can request access, you might want to tighten that up a little bit and keep it to a business need to know as much as you can. But similarly, giving people access to your incident response, from a technology standpoint, that certainly doesn't, it's not a bad idea. You want people to be able to see that, but you also want to be able to keep some of those secrets if you can. So that's, as like everything, the answer is somewhere in between. But keeping those out-of-band communication methods tested, validated, and confirmed. Again, yeah, you're right. It's going to blow up your phone. It might be annoying, but if you say, hey, this is just a drill, you don't have to do anything. If you didn't see some of this, or if you don't see this text, or if you don't get something, please reach out to this number, and we can go ahead and make that happen. And then, you do some follow-up to make sure that all of your incident teams in your incident response plan got the message, were notified, acknowledged it, they moved on, and do so regularly. And again, that's another process that can be done semi or fully autonomously. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a manual thing if you don't want it to be. But yeah, testing those before you have a problem goes a long way, because the time to figure out that you have an issue is not mid-incident. That doesn't work out well for anyone.
Yeah, the other thing too there is differentiating between a cyber incident response and a natural disaster or a special event response. Because with a cyber, you may go to out-of-band communications. That's pure cell phones. That's pure an encrypted tunnel channel, such as Telegram or an app that the adversary isn't going to have put themselves in the middle of.
Right.
And a natural disaster, you're okay. And to use the analogy of Alice from a Bob and
Alice
conversation, you got Evil Eve. In a natural disaster, I don't care if you hear my comms to a certain extent, because now security is out the door. It's now safety. And I think a lot of companies forget that safety is your number one priority. It's the safety of your employees first, then it's the response to your company. And if your organization has any fidelity behind that, they will make sure the employee knows that you're my first response, not the health of my company. It's, are my employees safe? Mm-hmm. Do they have what they need? Are they in a location? Then we start the restoration for the company. Restoration of your employee is first, then restoration of the company.
Yep, for sure. Just wanted to note for people watching the slides, I had put training after communications and then practice, but we started talking about testing, so I moved up to the practice slide. We'll go back to training in a minute. But Tyler, did you have any thoughts on the idea of testing and practice?
Well, I mean, it's just like security awareness, right? I mean, it's a muscle that you got to work out, and if you don't work out, it's not gonna work. It's like tying your shoes. You do, what is instinct when, stuff hits the fan. And I think, I mean, training and practice, right? There's a distinction there. So I think it's, a large part of knowing what to do. I think for each person, you have to kind of figure out, what people, places, systems, what exactly is needed for this.
Mm-hmm.
And then see how it works. You gotta, I mean, it's one thing to theorize, oh, we could use this as a backup, but you don't know until you give it a shot. And I find that just doing that in practice and seeing, how it works, you discover a lot more than you would as a thought, experiment, asking people, surveying people. I think that's really the only way that you're gonna hammer out the details and make it as seamless as possible. I mean, we're talking bad stuff happening, so that's difficult, but it all starts with personal safety.
Yep, for sure. I think, we're all on the same page, that safety is always the number one thing. The reason I put this third was training as third was, I thought we talk about communication. We talk about, okay, now that we've defined the processes, people have a general sort of understanding or expectation. What do we need to tell them? And every organization is different, right? In terms of how you do incident response or what you consider to be an incident that is reportable. So we need to train people on those specific types of events that they should be watching for, and we need to teach them how to report those things if it's not something that everybody will notice at one time, like a disaster or a major outage. So when we teach people, what are the things you look for? Number one, I think, is how to get safe. Number two would be how do you find where to get more information about what's going on and what you need to do to get back to normal, get safer, but get back to normal. And then I think once we've defined that and we've taught people, then I was thinking we then can go into that practice and training mode to maintain, the muscle memory, as Tyler calls it, the ability for people to, I just remember now where I need to go or who I need to talk to. It's, it's a lot, to me, it's a lot like fire drills, right? We do fire drills every Fire Safety Month, once a year. Do we need to do practice more than, any particular frequency? What would you guys recommend for practicing for all employees around the incident or BCP?
Yeah. So like I said before, like from a company wide or like the business continuity side, quarterly to semi-annually works well to do those drills to make sure that you get people aware of what the message looks like, what the phone looks like. And to be honest, you get to test two things. If they weren't prepared for it, do they respond and do they share it? Like, do they actually respond? What is your response rate? And then does people actually call in? Do they report to their help desk, hey, I got this message. It looks concerning because it's abnormal, as we talked in previous calls. Or do they talk to their management about it? I think the other thing too, from an IR point of view, you got to reinforce the fact that you don't go outside our four walls anytime an event happens. Legal is the only one who should be talking externally, because you don't want to put your company in a situation where it was handled internally. It was fine. There was no breach. There was no customer data leaked or anything else. And now you've got brand issues because an employee sent something to the local newspaper, picked up the phone and said something to a local agency. And that happens. I mean, we've talked about in previous calls, they get a phishing email, but instead of reporting it, they call their bank or they call an external entity. And that's where your training comes back and you practice what to do. Like, again, see something, say something, but who's that say something to? Is it your help desk? Is it your SOC? Is it your legal department? Is it your ethics line? Like learning where those numbers are at and how to use them, and sharing what is a use case for each of those, when to call ethics, when to call HR, when to call legal, when to call the help desk, when to report it directly to your security operations center.
Cool. And so I had kind of divided business continuity and disaster recovery from incident response, but we've started talking about that. So I think it's a parallel set of discussions. And as you pointed out, Fletus, there are a lot of other types of situations and communication media you can start to use when it's merely what we call an incident. I'm sort of diminishing the value of it, but it's really just these are things that happen more frequently, right? With phishing attack or ransomware event or things like that. And people then generally do need to be trained on spotting those different types of, high risk threats and what are the common methods for them to report those things.
I think the biggest thing there is helping them understand the difference between an event and an incident. I think people forget events or triggers, that something just happened. The incident is when there's a negative connotation, there's a consequence. The event just means something happened. The event could be a false positive, a true negative, a false negative, a true negative. They're still events, and we expect events to happen. And that's why we have policies, procedures in place for the event. It's not an incident until there is a compromise, a consequence to that event.
So I thought of a certain type of event I wanted to talk to about now that you mention it. And I'd like to get your guys and the attendees input on this is, suppose, for example, an organization handles personal information of citizens, customers, et cetera. And you've got certain staff who are authorized to handle or touch that information, access it. And you have other staff that don't expect to have to deal with that stuff on a regular basis. Let's say an employee who doesn't normally deal with it, all of a sudden one day in an email sees a credit card number or a piece of personal information from a person. What do you typically define that as? Is that an event? Is that an incident? Is it a compliance violation? What would you guys call that?
I'll take it first. I'll go. Just seeing a single piece of data is not something that I'm as concerned about. If it's just the credit card, because I don't have enough information to build it unless they've got a full profile, like the name, their birthday, their address, their social. Now I've got enough to build a profile. Just seeing a number or account number, that happens every time you swipe your card at a store. The cashier could see the card number. The waitress takes your card away from your table if you're in the US versus paying at the table. I don't see that as big of an issue. It's when you have enough data to start it to impersonate or to be able to build a case that I know enough that I can now impersonate that person by picking up the phone, talking with an agent. Yes, this is my name. This is my address. This is my birth date. This is the 3-digit code on the back of the card, because you have enough to now impersonate that user. So that's where I would go with that event. That's my belief, my preference.
So you're saying we need to teach people in general what constitutes something that would be a full profile or something that could be used to impersonate somebody or cause damage to them, right? Tyler,
it goes back to it also goes back to, do they report it or they just delete it?
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes you got to do both. Sometimes if the user deletes it, it's okay. But if they delete and report, now you've got an after action, a lessons learned opportunity. Please check your sender list. Please make sure it's encrypted if you sent it in plain text or did not. So there's a lot of other strings you can pull on that analogy. So
yeah, nice. AJ or Tyler?
I think the credit card, let's say it's just your credit card, number, no CVV, none of the information that would otherwise make it useful, right?
Yeah.
I think what's kind of key here is we know, and I think there's a large part of people know that number on its own is not useful. You need a lot more data to make use of it. But I think it's the principle of it, that there was a slip up, a leak, a very minor incident, let's call it, where, is it going to make a difference if they just delete it? It's a slip up, probably not. But I think it's the little things like that where you get to see, how is this awareness training? How are our protocols and standards, being upheld here? Because I think a lot of times it's when it doesn't, maybe matter as much, that you kind of get to see, because then that person, either out of habit or because they've had the standards and processes ingrained in them, just de facto, reports it, says, hey, this was sent to me, whatever caused that to arise needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a hole in the system that, by itself may be small, but you never know when someone has a messed up sender list. They may send something more confidential to someone else who might not be, on the same team. I mean,
so you want to err on the safe side, right? Get people to recognize and report those things that are approaching being a full.
I mean, it's an ideal situation, right? All in cybersecurity, we'd love it if everyone reported, stuff, but it's also, there's a balance. Someone's reporting every time they hear, a little sound that can be overwhelming. So it's a balance between individual responsibility and, how strictly you want to enforce those standards. But I'd always err on the side of caution.
Cool. AJ?
Well, like everything, it depends. So in your analogy there, the credit card number in the email, who sent it? Was it a client? And this is rhetorical. So, did the client send it in because they're making a purchase and they couldn't hear somebody on the phone and they figured email would be easier? That's not really a fault that you can resolve. That's not a system error. You can't just sit there and bounce an email back because 16 digits past the LUN algorithm. It doesn't work like that. So you can really go ahead and put some of those controls, but at the end of the day, it's super diminishing returns. It's easier just to go, hey, client, this is not what you should be doing. Here's why this is a big deal. We'll accept it this time. Please don't make this a habit. But the other side of it becomes, if your attacker sent you your corporate card unencrypted in the email and said, we have access to this database and here's proof. Well, now you have an incident. So like everything, it's really about the intent. It's the malice at the heart of the action and the intent to do harm from the bad actor. That's what really differentiates between an event and an incident. So when you take that into account from a training perspective, does everybody need to know the difference? Maybe, maybe not. It depends how secure you want to build your organization or how your reporting mechanisms go into place with regards to the different business units. Some parts of the organization maybe have practically no involvement in the incident response plan and don't really need to be super involved. So giving them that information is useful and helpful and provides that extra layer of knowledge. But again, you have to be careful because you can get too much in the way of information and then they sort of run out of, kind of the capacity to process it. So it has to be really specific. So back to this email example, if it was coming, from inside the environment and somebody was mishandling that data, that's a coaching opportunity. There's some technical controls that you wrap around that. There's some personnel management. You might get HR involved and say, hey, listen, this is a continued problem with you. This has to get resolved. So that training now gets amended to include those scenarios where this is how you handle the sensitive data going in and out. But again, it really depends on where that information came from, what was the context around it, and how does that get processed down the line.
So you're saying it depends.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a weird cop-out answer, but yeah, in kind of a generic example like that, that's something that we've all seen. Somebody sending email that doesn't, that has too much information. We've all been guilty of that, where we send something we probably shouldn't have over email. So it's just one of those, like, what is the impact? What is the problem? Where did this come from? Again, if it's your attacker sending your corporate card in the clear, get that IR plan up and running. We have, order some pizzas. We're going to be here a while. So those are things that you need to keep in the back of your mind when you're getting some of this reporting coming in. What is the overall impact? What is the source of this? And what do we have to do as a result? That's where all of your processes and planning come into effect.
Yeah. It always ties back to the planning side, which involves a lot more, focused skill set of people and a subset of the organization. But we always have to keep in mind the ultimate employees and what they're going to need to know. We got a plan in place. Did we tell anybody about it? So that's the bottom line, right? And do people have a chance to practice it? So I think I just wanted to make sure that we cover those things. What I'd like to do now, just to respect people's time, I think we're getting close to the end. Just like anybody to think about what you got the most out of in this session and just type it in the chat and let us know, if this was useful. Was there something that you can take back to your organization and, maybe help with the communication side or with the planning side, or tips that you can use for your awareness program.
Is that a stock photo of somebody fishing the sun?
It is.
Huh.
No, it's supposed to be a eureka moment. It's things
that
so
like, that's
I just discovered this thing.
I'm going to steal the sun. Yeah, I don't think anybody could match that. It's like cartoonish levels of super villainy there.
All right. Cool. So I think we covered everything well enough. I don't see any major eureka moments from people. But Joseph said it was useful. Generally, good advice that we have to think about the humans, the safety side. Really good point. Thanks, Joseph. All right. So now is the time for just sort of, we didn't, sometimes I try to come up with the topic for the next session. Usually we'll do this 2 weeks at a time. So the next one will be 2 weeks. I'll give you the date for that in a minute, but we'd like to just get your thoughts on what sort of topics you like to have covered in the future. So, we've done 2 episodes on the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. That's coming up still. We might still want to talk about it again, and I'm happy to, if people want to discuss that. But, there are a lot of other topics that, touch on security awareness, phishing, risk management, business cases for security awareness, anything like that. We'd be happy to, visit in a deeper dive and try and do this kind of conceptual discussion. So social engineering sounds like a great idea. So we'll take that into consideration, wait for a little bit more feedback before we decide. But thanks very much, Joseph, for the suggestion. Just wanted to put the little plug in for ClickArmor. ClickArmor is the first fully gamified awareness training, assessment, and engagement platform that builds employee resilience and a strong corporate culture. So we're really trying to help organizations become more productive, not just compliance focused, but risk focused, trying to make sure that people actually retain the knowledge that they obtain within a really immersive platform. So I'm going to be starting to do live office hours on a weekly basis. So you'll see that on LinkedIn. You'll see Scott's live, and just come and join me there when you see it. But you can sign up for the next session already, even if we don't know what it is. I will put it up there very soon. But you can go to the clickarmor.ca/CSAF page, where we've got all the recorded videos linked from our YouTube page. And you can also just sign it up for the form, and we'll make sure you get notified when the next session is ready to be registered. And so that's it for today, folks. Really wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Any final thoughts from the panel?
I think, like with everything, practice makes perfect, right? And I think that it starts with figuring out who needs to know what, and what's important. Only, you got to tell the employees what's important to them. Don't overwhelm them. And like a fire drill, you got to practice it. That'll show you the flaws, and that'll show you, if it works, which is what's important.
Excellent. Any other comments from AJ or Fletus before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll add, this can apply both to your personal life too. Take time to figure out how you will handle situations in your home. If you haven't practiced escaping from your home, or telling, if you have young kids or elderly folks, where your muster point is, share that with them. So in the event something happens at your house, you know where to go. You know how to get out of the house. You understand it. Do you have a ladder readily available for a second floor exit? I do. Do you know how to properly fall out of a building? Like, if you had to jump, do you know what to do? Like, those are
you practice falling out of the building too?
I'm not asking you to practice falling out of a building.
I go ahead
but
first.
Also the same thing. I mean, you can also apply it to, as I said, you get into a car accident. What's the first thing you do? Remaining calm. Like, how do you take photos? Like, business continuity and incident response applies to our personal lives as much as our professional lives. That's all I wanted to conclude with here. Just practice those, think through those, and plan how you're going to handle when it happens, not if it happens. So
awesome. Thanks a lot, Fletus. AJ?
Yeah, people make mistakes. Plan accordingly and have controls.
Excellent. All right, guys. So we'll let you go now. And thanks everyone for joining us. Really hope you'll join us next time. I didn't put the date. Oh, yes, it was on the previous slide. It was October 5th. So come back and join us October 5th. We'll see you all then.